Hi students, how are you? I hope all of you have been enjoying your first few weeks of school. Welcome to the first official class of our constitutional MDC dual enrollment class. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Renee Medina, Mr. Medina. Again, by this point, you should have had a chance to see the syllabus quiz that I've posted, which is due on Wednesday. I'll tell you the date. Wednesday, it falls on Wednesday, September 16th by 11:59 p.m. And you should also at this point have seen the PowerPoint presentations for chapters 1 and 2. We're going to be going over them today in this lecture. So I very quickly wanted to, first of all, make sure that I went over the syllabus so that we could, so that everybody could be on the same page. Remember that it's your responsibility, first and foremost, to make sure that you're enrolled in 3 different places. Number one, Blackboard. So if you're still not enrolled in Blackboard, my advice is that you speak with Miss Tere Oliver, as she is the person who would be helping you in that capacity. I have sent you guys an updated list as of today at noon, and today, September 12th, at noon, of the number of the list of students who are currently enrolled in Blackboard. So you got to make sure that you're enrolled in Blackboard because that's MDC's way of knowing that you're taking this class. And that's how you know that MDC recognizes that you are in this class. So it's your job to make sure that you're in Blackboard. That's one. Two, that you're on the Remind 101, which I think I had 31 students. All 31 students that I've heard are in the class were enrolled in Remind 101. And then three, it's your job to also make sure that you're in Google Classroom. And I think there were a few of you that still may not be in Google Classroom. I think one of you still wasn't in Google Classroom. So it's your job to make sure that everybody is in each one of those 3 phases. Now, regarding the syllabus, I have it here for sharing for a moment. You can reach me at my MDC email, which is rmedina2@mdc.edu. If not, you can also email me at rmedina@matterlakes.org. Again, rmedina@matterlakes.org. That's my Matter Lakes email. Regarding how this class meets, that's one of the most common questions that I've received, and I've tried addressing it in different places. So I want to remind you guys that we are fully online, basically. And what that means is I'm going to be posting class lectures online along with the PowerPoint presentations that I want you to review before coming into class, or before watching the lecture, I should say. But that you and I will not be meeting in a Zoom meeting or in a face-to-face capacity for this course. Instead, you are going to be responsible for making sure that you pay attention to the PowerPoint presentations, to the lectures, and to any material that I post for you to do. And it's your responsibility to make sure that you are staying on top of those due dates, because I will not be sending you reminders of when things are due via Remind 101. It's your job to make sure that as a college student, you're on top of your grade. Now, there is no textbook that I am making you take for this class. The PowerPoint presentations that I have used are basically from the textbook, and I am sharing them with you for you to have with you. Now, officially, this class would meet at 6 p.m. The reason I requested that is not that you and I, again, we're not meeting you and I ever, but the reason I said 6 p.m. was for those of you who wanted to be able to take Miss Alonso's English class, which I think is from 3 to 5:30. There is no conflict of schedule now for this semester. Regarding the course outline, everything is going to be based off of total number of points. So your writing assignment, which you have one essay for the course, is worth 500 points. The syllabus quiz that you should take before Wednesday at midnight is worth 50 points. And then we have class discussions. What I mean by that is it's your job to make sure that you comment on a class discussion topic that I've posted online, and I will post those throughout the course. A total of 9 of them will be assigned. I have already assigned for week 1 the class discussion topic that I want you to provide a response for. It is a minimum of 100 words. I will be grading those assignments based off of your grammar, punctuation, how clearly you express your opinion, how clearly you express your thoughts. and whether I felt that you put some effort into trying to express yourself cohesively. If I see a discussion that is full of grammatical mistakes and it didn't seem like there was a lot of effort on your part to try and express an opinion in a clear and intelligible manner, then you won't be getting a grade for that assignment. So each one of those is worth 50 points, and there will be a total of 9 of them throughout the course. And then I'm also giving you an open book midterm and an open book final exam. Obviously, by open book, probably what I'm talking about is really the PowerPoint presentations and any notes that you choose to take based off of my class lectures, right? And those exams will be multiple choice, and you will have a day to do them. They're assigned on particular days, and you have to make sure that you do them on that day at some point in your day. Otherwise, you will be not getting a good grade. And the total number of points that you will be receiving are 2,000 points. Okay, so that's 2,000 total points, and the grade distribution is done here. You can see from 1,800 to 2,000 points gets you an A, from 1,600 to 1,799 points gets you a B, from 70 to 79 gets you a C, and so on and so forth. The other thing I wanted to make sure that I went over with you is the syllabus in terms of what we are going to cover on a weekly basis for the class. So as you can see on the right-hand column, the assignments are what I want you to have done before you step into watching these lectures, right? So I want you to read the PowerPoint presentations for chapters 1 and 2 before watching this lecture. I want you to read, and that's really what I'm hoping for you guys to do. So today I'm going to cover chapter 1, and next class I will be covering chapter 2. So by the time that you get into chapter 2, you would have already seen the PowerPoint presentation. Okay. So this is the syllabus. This tells you all the information that you need for the syllabus. And a reminder again, if you haven't already signed up for Google Classroom, this is the Google Classroom code that you're supposed to be using. And that's where you'll find this lecture and all of the other assignments for this class. I don't believe that we will be returning, even if we return or when we return to Matter Lakes, this class will continue being done in this manner. So we will never really officially meet on campus, on site at any moment during this course. It's your job to make sure that you submit assignments on time. If you submit assignments late, there is a 10% reduction in your maximum grade that you will have for each day that you are late. So for example, if you turn in an essay one day late, the highest grade you can get is 90% of the total number of points that you could have gotten. So you need to make sure that you are on top of submitting things on time. Don't leave things for the last minute, 11:59 p.m., because many of you do that, and then your computer crashes, you have an issue with your wireless internet, and that's not my responsibility. That's not my job. It's your fault for choosing to leave things to turn them in on the last second. And as a result, something bad happens and you can't work around that. So please, I beg you, make sure you are on top of your grades, because it's not my job. I'm not going to worry about people who turned in their assignments. You turn them in 5 minutes late, it's going to be graded late. So keep that in mind. And here you see the writing prompt for the essay that I want you guys to be working on. I will discuss this in more detail as we get closer to the essay assignment due date. But I want you to make sure that you follow the rules for this assignment, right? Here is the question. I'm asking that you guys submit a 1,000-word minimum essay for this. And I want you to make sure that you answer these questions in detail in 12-point font, double-spaced. I want you to make sure that you've proofread your essay before you submit it, because again, grammar and punctuation and how clearly you express your ideas will be part of the grade. And make sure that you follow the APA format when you're actually referencing sources, which I'm asking you to do at least 3 outside sources to provide your answer. And here's the rubric that I will use to grade that essay. So if you have any questions on that, feel free to email me and we'll go from there. Now, the next thing I wanted to do is get into this chapter 1 lesson, which there's the only PowerPoint that we're going over today. Next week, we'll go over the chapter 2 PowerPoint, and you'll be, that's how we'll unfold things. So chapter 1 talks about the historical overview of how we end up with our Constitution, how we end up having this document, right? And I want to talk a little bit about the roots of the Constitution, how the United States developed, and how the Constitution and the Bill of Rights came into existence, right? So first, we need to have a few definitions in mind. Now, if you've taken one of my law classes before at Madder Lakes, I've given you a different definition for what a law is. I'm going to stick with the Miami-Dade definition for Miami-Dade and my personal definition for my Madder Lakes classes. So the definition that the textbook for this Miami-Dade course offers you regarding what a law is, it's a body of rules established to support the norms of that society, enforced through legal means, that is punishment. So again, it's very simple. I mean, you have a series of rules that support what behavior is allowed within society. And the way that we make sure that those rules are enforced is with consequences, with punishments. So if somebody breaks a law, there are consequences. If you commit a crime, if you commit murder, there are consequences to murder. If you break a contract, which is not a criminal issue, there are consequences for you to have broken. The law dictates what the consequences are for you having broken that agreement. So laws are always going to have consequences attached to them so that we can make sure that people actually follow the laws and don't try to break them. Now, you are in a constitutional law class, so the next question that you should be asking yourselves is, what's a constitution? And the book defines a constitution as a system of basic laws and principles that establish the nature, functions, and limits of a government or other institution. So what this means is a constitution is a document that describes the powers and limits of government. So it creates the government, and it describes what powers that government has and what limits that government also has. So the U.S. Constitution is about 230 years old, give or take a year. It's a very new constitution compared to some of the older constitutions that have been around for a longer time. For example, the Magna Carta, which is the constitution for the British, or the first document that they consider part of their constitution, came into existence around the 1200s, and they've had it around for over 800 years. So you can see that there's a very big difference in years. So our Constitution is very young, but what it is, it's also very flexible. It's very, there's a lot of ways. It's not rigid. It's not strict. It's not very long. There are some constitutions in other parts of the world that are very, very long, where they decided to write a lot of information in there. And that makes it a lot more difficult to process and study. One of the benefits of our Constitution is that it's, by comparison, pretty tight, pretty short, pretty compact. And that makes it easier for us to understand and break down and be able to get an understanding of. So part of how our country began and part of what our mentality began is that we are really descendants of many different groups. Unlike other parts of the world, like for example, Japan or China, where it's been the same society and without outsiders for thousands of years, the United States actually became the United States with a mix of different cultures. And you're looking in there at, particularly when we first began as a country, Native Americans, African Americans, and colonialists. Now, colonialists is a very fancy term that we use to describe people who came from European countries, England, France, Germany, the Netherlands, eventually places like Germany, Italy, and so forth, Ireland. And they came over and they actually settled the territory that now we call the United States of America. And what they each did, each group contributed in their own way into the creation of this United States. However, this textbook is going to focus primarily on the colonists because those were the main power brokers. They were the people who had most of the power when the Constitution began and when the Constitution was written. Specifically, the country where we come from, obviously, are the British, and there were a series of problems that we had, that the colonials, American colonials, had with the British government. Britain got into a very expensive war called the 10-Year War prior to, actually it was a 7-year war, prior to around the 1760s. And that war became very expensive. It was a French and Indian War. It was a war between the French and the British. And the British wanted to be able to pay off the debt from that war. And what they had to do, what they decided to do, was raise the taxes of the individual. Sorry about that. They wanted to raise the taxes of the individual colonies in what we now call the United States. The colonials got very upset. Obviously, this is part of basic U.S. history. They got very upset. They got progressively more and more upset, and they started wanting to be independent so that they themselves could decide when to raise taxes and how much they should pay in taxes. It was all a matter of whether they should be given a voice in the decision making on whether taxes should be increased. The British felt that that the colonials did not need to have that representation. The colonials did, and as a result, that's where you start seeing the eventual breakup of the British Empire in terms of controlling the land that we now call the United States. So eventually, some main leaders, we call them delegates, 55 of them, meet in Philadelphia in 1774, and they write a series of complaints to the British king, asking for the British king to meet the demands of the Americans, right, of the American colonials. They weren't yet breaking off from Britain. They weren't yet calling for independence, but these are the seeds that eventually lead to the American Revolution. And eventually after that, the British king refuses, and this leads to the United States breaking away from the British with the Declaration of Independence that is signed by the delegates of the Second Continental Congress on July 4th, 1776. And so that's the revolution, right? The Second Continental Congress establishes an army, and they name George Washington as the commander. They raise money for the war. The war gets fought out. They were pretty committed to fighting for war, although there was a very even split between people who wanted to remain with the British, people who wanted to break away from the British, and people who didn't want to have a voice or an opinion on the matter one way or another. And like I said, the Declaration of Independence, there are 5 main components to it. Now, the first paragraph explains the purpose of the Declaration. Why was the Declaration of Independence actually written? The second paragraph, one of the most well-known paragraphs, and one of the paragraphs that I go over with my law study students, talks about how all men are created equal, and how all men are endowed by God, are given by God certain rights that no man may take away from them, including the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I mention God because it's important to recognize and acknowledge that our founding fathers believed very strongly in the concept of God. And so much so that they literally mention God in the very beginning, twice in the very beginning of the Declaration of Independence, as perhaps their way of showing who they believe they receive their rights from and who human beings receive their rights from. The third paragraph of the Declaration of Independence kind of is like the list of complaints against the king. This is kind of like where they lay down the main argument as to why the king has let down the individual American colonies. The fourth paragraph talks about what the efforts that the colonists have taken, what the efforts look like to try and bring about a peaceful resolution with the British king that didn't involve a revolution, that didn't involve breaking away from the king. And last but not least, the fifth paragraph declares the independence of the United States, the breaking away of the United States from the British. And it mentions what the United States can now do as a brand new and independent country. So um, once the war is fought and won, congratulations. In case you didn't know, Americans obviously win. The first document that creates the government of the United States, the first government of the United States, is what is known as the Articles of Confederation. Now, the Articles of Confederation many times get a very bad reputation, but there is some good that came with the Articles of Confederation. For example, the Articles of Confederation is the document that creates the government that finances and defeats the British Army and the British Navy, which at that time was the strongest military in the world. So they were successfully able to lead a government and lead an army and create an army that defeated the British to the point that the British retreated, and they eventually recognized in 1783, I think, through the Treaty of Paris, that the United States are free, that the United States are a brand new and independent country. So the Articles of Confederation, what they promise is a league of friendship, meaning that each individual state, they used to be each individual colony, but now each individual state, 13 individual states, promise to be very good friends, promise to assist each other for defense purposes, so for military purposes, to protect themselves. And pretty much that's about it. It creates an extremely weak national government, and that's the main criticism of the Articles of Confederation, this notion that it didn't give enough power to the national government to be able to succeed. But it did give Congress the ability to wage war, to declare war, and to declare peace. And it did have the ability to borrow money and to organize trade with the Native Americans, which at that time was a very important thing, given that they were still the main group that lived throughout most of the New World. Now, the Articles of Confederation were not enough. That was that was very clear from the beginning, because different issues arose. For example, New York State could impose taxes on New Hampshire if it wanted to, so that it would make it harder for somebody from New Hampshire to sell potatoes in New York. And obviously, if New York did that, New Hampshire had the ability to retaliate. So trade was stopped. Aside from that, each state had its own kind of currency, which made it a little bit difficult. And for purposes of trade, each state controlled its own trade policy with different countries. So New York would sign a trade agreement with France, and Georgia would sign its own separate trade agreement with France. And that obviously made for very difficult relationships between the other countries who considered this laughable and the individual states, the United States of America. So eventually they decide that they need a new government, and that government is going to be created through a second document. And that second document is the focus of this class. We call that document the United States Constitution. And that creates the current second government of the United States of America. Because remember, the Articles of Confederation create the first document of the United States of America. Now, one of the main influences of the US Constitution actually is the Magna Carta, which is, like I told you, the document that limited the power. It was the first document that limited the power of the British king, King John, which was signed in the 1200s. I forgot the exact year, early 1200s. And what it did, like the PowerPoint presentation shows you, is it began to chisel away, it began to chip away the power that one king could have. So that by the time that the Americans were actually fighting the British monarchy in 1776, the British king was severely weakened by comparison to how powerful they used to be even 100 or 200 years before that. Okay. Um, Thomas Jefferson knew this, and the Declaration of Independence is actually a little bit of an exaggeration when they accuse King George of committing a bunch of violations to the British, to the Americans, because it really wasn't King George who had the ultimate power in many ways. It was a parliament, which was and remains the British version of Congress. So when you look at what is a document that influences the U.S. Constitution, the Magna Carta is a good place to start. And like I told you, the Articles of Confederation were not good enough. And eventually, in 1787, Congress meets to revise the Articles. And that's very important for you to understand because the original purpose of the meeting was to to revise, change some parts of the Articles of Confederation, not to write a brand new document. But they chose to write a brand new document, and that document we now call the U.S. Constitution. So, what is the purpose of the United States Constitution? Well, first off, to create a central national government that had the power to deal directly with individuals rather than states. For example, under the Articles of Confederation, states had the option of choosing how much taxes they wanted to pay to the national government. And of course, if anybody's ever given the option of whether they want to pay taxes or not, the answer for that's always going to be no, I don't want to pay extra taxes. Are you crazy? And that's actually what we start seeing changing with the Constitution. The Constitution actually allows the national government through Congress to collect taxes. It also has as a purpose this notion that we want to create a system of checks and balances, meaning we don't want any branch or any portion of government to be too powerful compared to the others. So they create a system of checks and balances so that each branch of the government serves as a control to make sure that no branch becomes too powerful. And the three branches of government, of course, are the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. And a third main purpose of the Constitution, kind of like an extension of this second point, is to guarantee that no single individual became too powerful. We did not want another king. We did not want another king. However, we did want to have a national leader. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was no national leader. Under the U.S. Constitution, there is a national leader, and that's who we refer to as the president. I've already gone over this. So let's go into a little bit more detail regarding the legislative branch. And the legislative branch is the first branch we go over because it's the first article of the Constitution. In other words, the first article of the U.S. Constitution purposely talks about the legislative or lawmaking branch of the federal government. Why did they start with the legislative branch? Because they did not want to start with the executive branch. They wanted to make sure, normally you always start off with your strongest point, and they didn't want people to mistakenly think that the executive branch was the strongest point. So instead, they begin with the legislative branch. And the legislative branch is what we call Congress. It's formed of the House of Representatives and the Senate. And they have the ability to write laws, to pass laws, but they cannot enforce those laws, nor can they interpret the meaning of those laws, right? The executive branch is what's going to enforce the laws. The judicial branch is what's going to interpret the laws. The legislative branch contains the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise was very important because there was a main problem involving how representation should be done in the United States, in the legislative branch. I'm sorry. What do I mean by that? Well, how would this new government choose lawmakers? Should those lawmakers be done based off of the population of each individual state, meaning that a larger state like New York would have more representatives than a smaller state like Delaware? Or should each state have the same number of lawmakers assigned to it? And that was the formula, by the way, in the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation treated each state as equal. So an extremely small state, like I said, like Delaware, had as much power as a much larger, more populous state like New York. And if you're from New York, you don't think that's a fair solution. That's not what you want. But if you're from Delaware, you love that solution and you want to make sure that your opinion matters as much as the opinion of somebody from New York. So uh, the solution was to have a little bit of both, right? The solution was, let's implement both of these answers or both of these perspectives into the lawmaking branches. So when you're looking at the Congress, Congress has the House of Representatives, which are selected by by the total number of people that live in a state. Meaning that today, California, which is the largest state by population, has the largest number of members in the House of Representatives compared to Delaware, which may only have one, or Alaska, which may only have one. So in that aspect, states with more populations won, right? States with with a larger population get to exert their influence more heavily in the House of Representatives. However, it's called a compromise for a reason, because small states also secure a victory. The second branch, or the second division within the lawmaking branch, we call the Senate, right? The Senate is actually considered the upper house. The House of Representatives is considered the lower house. And so the Senate actually divides the lawmaking power in in equal shares. So each state has the same number of senators, and of course what that means is that Delaware and Alaska have two each, and California has two senators as well. Okay, so our Congress is a mix of representation based off of power being given to states who have more population on the one hand, and also power being evenly distributed between each and every single state on the other hand. Okay, and that's all outlined here. They also mention the different powers, some of the powers that each chamber has, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One of the earliest Supreme Court cases involving congressional power was the case that is known as McCulloch versus Maryland. And what this Supreme Court case dealt with was, does Congress have the power to create a bank, and does the state of Maryland have the power to tax it? And this was actually an important case because it's one of the earlier cases where we try to figure out who is stronger in that relationship, the federal government or the individual state. Under the Articles of Confederation, the individual state was significantly more powerful than the national government. It wasn't even called a federal government, it was called a Confederate government. Well, it would have been called a Confederate government, probably. However, here, in this case, the Supreme Court of the United States determines that under the Constitution, remember, they're the ones that decide what the Constitution means. They're the ones who interpret the Constitution and all laws, all federal laws and treaties. And their conclusion is that the state of Maryland cannot tax a government creation, a federal government agency, a federal government institution, in this case, the bank, because the state of Maryland does not have the power under the Constitution to do that. Okay. The most significant part of that Article 1, again, we talked about how Article 1 is the article that talks about the legislative branch. The most significant section within that article is by far Section 8, which grants the specific powers that the U.S. that the Constitution gives to Congress, and those powers are very broad, very large. Congress has the power to create its own money, and that's how Congress has George Washington on the $1 bill. The power to create post offices, the power to collect and raise taxes, the power to borrow money, the power to regulate trade and commerce. Remember that was very difficult with the Articles of Confederation. That gets resolved here. And not just that, they have the power to make sure that individual states cannot tax one another. They're the only ones who can tax trade between states. The power of creating citizens. So if you're somebody that originally was born in Cuba and you want to become a U.S. citizen, the steps you have to take and the procedures you have to follow to become a U.S. citizen, all of that can be determined by Congress and by federal law. The power to create armed forces, meaning the power to create the military, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. And of course, the power to also start wars. That's all given to Congress. Now, one of the powers that also is found within that section is what is known as the elastic clause. Now, why is it called elastic? If something is elastic, it means it's very flexible, right? Very flexible. So the name, we've given it the nickname of the elastic clause because what this part of Article 1 says is that Congress has the power to do anything that is necessary and proper. That's a quotation. Congress has the power to do anything that is necessary and proper to pass laws for the nation, as in accordance with the powers that are given under Section 8. So what this means is we can interpret these bullet points very broadly because Congress is going to have a lot of power in being able to pass laws that somehow impact these and other powers that the U.S. Constitution gives. Okay? So that's Article 1. And I want to clarify something. The way that the Constitution is divided is, and I maybe should have started off by saying this first, but articles, they're kind of like, you can think of them almost as like your chapters or your units, right? So like if this was a textbook, the articles will be considered the main unit, like each major unit of the Constitution. Sections, we can kind of think of them almost as like chapters, right? So sections are the individual chapters within the units, within the articles. And clauses, we can kind of think of them as almost like individual pages or subparts of the chapters. Okay, so articles are the big ones, chapters are a little bit bigger and still smaller. I'm sorry, articles are the big ones, sections are a little bit smaller, and then of course at the lower end are clauses. So if you hear me refer to Article 1, you know that we're talking about the main unit where we're describing the legislative branch and the powers that the legislative branch has and how anything that has to do with the creation of the legislative branch. Sections are the individual titles of the chapters for each main topic for the legislative branch. And then clauses are individual smaller subpoints to the sections. Okay, I hope that is clear. Anyway, we now move on to Article 2, which is the executive branch. Now, the executive branch is the president, right? And the executive branch was controversial at that time because many people didn't want a national leader. Many people didn't want a national leader. They didn't want a national leader. But if you're going to have a national government, you need a national leader. If you're going to have a country, you need a leader of that country. The fear was Americans didn't want to have another king. They didn't want to have a super powerful man in power again. And the purpose of the executive branch, and specifically the power that the president has, is to execute the laws, meaning they're the ones that get to enforce the laws that are passed by Congress. So that's one of their main powers. They're also the leader of the armed forces. So the president gets to decide how a war is fought and what resources are given in terms of how the war is going to be fought. So Congress pays for the war, but the president carries out the individual strategy for the war. They're the ones that make the decision. They approve the final strategy for wars. They also carry out the foreign policy, meaning how we interact with other countries is dealt with primarily by the president. The president deals primarily with how the United States is going to interact with Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, etc. They also have the power to appoint people into power, into offices. So they appoint ambassadors, judges, and other government officials that are needed for government. Now, Congress has to approve them, but the president selects them. The president appoints them, and then Congress has to approve. And if Congress rejects them, the president will appoint another person, and so on and so forth. Now, the president is chosen by electors, and this is something that's controversial to this day. But our founding fathers didn't want the average American to have a direct say in who got to become elected as president. When you are 18 and you vote for a presidential election, you are really voting for a person to represent your vote. We call them electors. And those electors are chosen. Each political party chooses their electors. So Donald Trump will choose electors, the number of electors for Florida. I think Florida right now has 27 electors. I could be wrong. It could be 29. And he will choose, in the event that Florida votes for Trump, the 27 people that Trump chose to vote for him will vote on the electoral college. But those voters have the option of voting for somebody else. And it's happened in rare occasions in American history. Now, most of the major actions that the president does have to be approved by the Senate. For example, the president writes a treaty involving an agreement between two or more countries, right? So the president signs a treaty between the United States and Italy. The Senate has to approve them. And for treaty purposes, the Senate has to vote by a 2/3 majority, supermajority, to get a treaty passed. Like I told you, judges and other appointed officials have to be approved by Congress. Aside from that, the president is required to show up in front of Congress and give Congress an updated state of affairs of how the country is running. The Constitution doesn't mention how frequently those updates have to be. American culture and the way the United States have chosen to do it is by giving what is known as a State of the Union, which is given early on once each year in January. But and the president may try to write laws, not that the president, to write bills, which are proposed laws, so that Congress can choose whether they want to vote on them or not. But the president does not get to vote on laws. However, the president does get to veto laws. And if the president vetoes a law, then Congress in order for that to become a law, Congress has to override it by a 2/3 majority. But ultimately, the biggest responsibility of the president is to make sure that laws are being enforced, meaning that if Congress passes a federal law banning the sale of cocaine, that federal agents are enforcing that law and punishing people who break that law. That's the president's main responsibility, to make sure that federal laws are being followed and enforced. Now, we finally get into Article 3. Article 3 deals with the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court and all federal judges. Federal judges are appointed by the president, and they hold office for life. So federal judges are not, one of the nice things for federal judges is that they're not under pressure by politics. They are there to faithfully, and by oath, they faithfully honor the U.S. Constitution and federal laws. So the judicial branch deals with interpreting the laws that are passed by Congress and signed by the president, if the president signs them. However, Congress does get to check the judicial branch. For example, Congress gets to vote on whether a federal judge becomes a federal judge in the first place. And Congress can also limit the type of cases that the Supreme Court may hear on appeal. So Congress can restrict which types of cases the Supreme Court decides on. Okay. So here we talk a little bit more about those checks and balances that I mentioned earlier in class. The president has the power to veto any law that is written by Congress, and Congress can overturn the president's veto by a 2/3 majority. Presidents get to nominate Supreme Court justices and other federal judges, but the legislative branch confirms or denies those nominations. And lastly, yes, while the president is in charge of leading the army, Congress decides whether war is going to take place or not, and whether they're going to finance a war or not. Okay. Now, Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution talks about what is known as the Supremacy Clause. What this means is that the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and to be more precise, the U.S. Constitution, federal laws, and federal treaties are the supreme law of the land, and in that order. So the U.S. Constitution, nothing can be above the U.S. Constitution. A treaty cannot be above it, federal law cannot be above it, state law cannot be above it, a city law cannot be above it, a state constitution cannot be above it. The U.S. Supreme Court is top dog. I'm sorry, the U.S. Constitution is top dog. Now, beyond that, and directly beneath it, in a tie, are federal laws and treaties. So federal laws and treaties are tied in terms of power, and they are more powerful than anything a state may do. Federal laws will be more powerful than a conflicting state law. The only way that that is not true is if the federal law that we're talking about goes against the U.S. Constitution, at which point the federal law is eliminated. But otherwise, federal law is always above state law, meaning that if Congress passes a law on taxes, an individual state cannot try to eliminate that law with their own laws. As the example we mentioned earlier, when we talked about the McCulloch versus Maryland case, Congress passed a law creating a bank, and that was given, Congress had the power to do that based off of their legislative powers under Article 1. Maryland tried to restrict that power by taxing the bank, and the U.S. Supreme Court said no. The state of Maryland is not above Congress, and they cannot do that. Okay. So Article 6 talks about how the U.S. Constitution is above everything else. It also requires the allegiance of every federal and state official to the Constitution. So everybody must swear an oath that they will faithfully honor the U.S. Constitution. And that's the main explanation for the Constitution, the United States Constitution. It was signed by 42 of the 55 delegates who were present. 3 of them refused to sign. One of them was George Mason. He's very well known. And he didn't sign it because there was no Bill of Rights. And we're going to talk later on about what the Bill of Rights were and what a Bill of Rights are. But it was signed in 1787. And that's how the U.S. Constitution became the document that all of these guys approved. However, in order to change the Articles of Confederation, which was the document that created the government of the United States, according to the Articles, every single state had to approve it. The U.S. Constitution asked for 9 out of the 13 states to approve it, which really would have been awkward because what if, it kind of violated the Articles of Confederation. Luckily, however, eventually, each and every single one of the 13 colonies, 13 states, signs the U.S. Constitution, eventually, but not before a fight. The whole argument as to whether the U.S. Constitution should be ratified, meaning passed, centered around 2 groups: those who supported it, which we call the Federalists, and those who were against it, which we call the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists wanted a stronger national government. They were upset with how weak the national government was in the Articles of Confederation. On the other hand, the anti-federalists wanted a weaker national government, and they wanted a document that protected the individual rights of Americans. And they wanted these rights in the form of what are known as Bill of Rights. Now, Bill of Rights were very common in states, in the individual states. So the states, for example, like Virginia had a Bill of Rights going from before the Revolutionary War. And these rights listed what the individual Virginian had as rights that could not be removed from them. But there were no official rights that the US Constitution originally had as part of the US Constitution. So the Anti-Federalists wanted to make a series of amendments, a fancy word for changes, to the US Constitution so that there were a Bill of Rights that protected the individual rights of Americans. And eventually, even though the Anti-Federalists lose in the war for the passage of the Constitution, because the US Constitution does get passed by 13 states, they do win a very important concession, which is one of our most important legal documents today. And those are the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution, which we refer to as the Bill of Rights. Okay. And what is the Bill of Rights, or what are the Bill of Rights? Well, the Bill of Rights, their purpose is to specifically outline individual rights that cannot be taken away from anybody. Okay. And here's a very brief outline of some of the power, or some of the rights that people have under the Bill of Rights. We'll talk about them in more detail throughout this course, but the First Amendment talks about freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, which in reality there is no freedom of religion. The freedom of religion is actually called the Free Exercise Clause right and the Establishment Clause right, because religious rights are divided into two in the First Amendment. So you'll never see me really referring this to as referring or using the title of freedom of religion, because I don't like it. I don't think that's accurate. But I'll stick with the PowerPoint for now. Aside from that, it also includes the freedom of the press, the right for people to assemble and hang out, and the right for people to petition or request their government to change courses of action. The Second Amendment deals with the right to keep and bear arms. We're talking about guns. The Third Amendment prohibits the federal government from forcing soldiers to stay in your house. And this was something that actually was commonly done by the British before the Revolutionary War. The Fourth Amendment guarantees your right to not have the government randomly search your house or your person without a warrant, unless there's special exceptions. The Fifth Amendment talks about how people who are treated as crimes, some of their rights, meaning, and this is obviously the one that you guys have heard in TV shows and everything, you have the right to not incriminate yourself. That's where you get the right of remaining silent. That's your Fifth Amendment right. You have the right to not say anything when you are under arrest, and to not have to be required to testify against yourself in court in a criminal case. The Sixth Amendment talks about how you can deal with accusations in criminal settings, meaning how a criminal defendant has the right to ask questions of witnesses that the government is using to try and prove the guilt of the defendant. You have the right to question them. You have the right to try and bring your own witnesses to show that the government cannot prove that you're guilty. It also talks about how you have the right to an attorney when you are being charged with a crime. And we'll talk again about these a little bit more in detail as the course develops. Article 7 deals with how you have the right to a trial by jury for federal civil cases where the total dollar amount goes above $20. Now, that was $20 in 1790. Obviously, $20 has been changed to adjust for inflation, so it's no longer 20. I forget how many tens of thousands of dollars it has to be before you have the right to a civil trial for a civil case, for a federal civil case. The Eighth Amendment protects you against torture. We call that cruel and unusual punishment. And also against excessive bails and fines. And we'll talk about that later on in the course. The Ninth Amendment has, it protects people uh, right. It says that any powers that are not specifically mentioned in the U.S. Constitution are given to the states. Um, and the kind of Ninth and Tenth Amendment are very similar in that regard, and we'll talk about them later on in the course. Now, while the Constitution is a very well-known and very popular and very good document, there were some flaws in it. It did not eliminate slavery. In fact, slavery is only going to get abolished in the Civil War once the 14th Amendment gets passed. However, the fact that the Constitution can be amended, it's one of the greatest gifts of the Constitution, that as society changes, if we see certain points of the Constitution that we no longer want to have as part of our government, we have the right to change it and include those changes to the U.S. Constitution. And so far, to this day, there have only been 27 changes to the Constitution of the United States. And that's pretty much it for today's lecture. Does anybody have any questions? Or obviously you're not here because you're not watching me, so I can't ask you that question. But if any of you have any questions, feel free to email me. Make sure you do the assignments. Make sure that you're doing on all those discussions that we talked about. And I will post my next video in about a week. Stay safe, everybody. And until next time. Bye, guys.